it was brought to my attention that the UK and the British Ministry of Defense, more specifically, they are shopping around for stockpiles of Soviet and Russian military equipment so that they can get it and send it to Ukraine. And it's all covered in this Wall Street Journal article right here. UK is shopping for old Soviet military gear to give Ukraine. And they're talking with the Defense Secretary, the British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace. And the article says the UK is buying Soviet and Russian-made defense equipment to provide to the Ukrainians to help them fight off the Russian invaders, the country's defense minister said. And they quote him as saying, if you really want to get it to the Ukrainians tomorrow morning so that they can continue to fight, find what they're trained on, find what they need. And this is the British Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, saying exactly what I've been saying in my recent updates, that sending Ukrainians Western equipment that they have not trained on, that they have no experience using, is a bad idea. It takes days, weeks, even months just to train someone how to basically operate some of this equipment. And then it takes months to years to learn how to integrate it tactically and strategically into combined arms warfare. You cannot just hand them a new tank, a new artillery piece, a radar system. You cannot just hand them that and have them seamlessly integrate it. It doesn't work that way. It's not an episode of G.I. Joe. It is real warfare. Armies develop these systems, take years to integrate them fully into their armed forces for a reason, because that is how long it takes. And just think about that. The last 8 years, the US and the rest of NATO, the last 8 years, they have been training thousands and thousands of Ukrainians. And don't take my word for it. Look at this US Department of Defense news article. DoD leaders say training Ukrainian forces is paying dividends, but is it really? And down here it says, from the beginning of the training mission until January 2022, the 7th Army Training Command had trained a total of 23,000 Ukrainians in Yaroviv. And that was the commander of the 7th Army Training Command. And if you remember Yaroviv, that was one of the centers in the Lvov region that Russia destroyed very early on in the fighting. And since then, the Pentagon has moved all of that training out of Ukraine, and they are training a fraction of the numbers of Ukrainians that they had been over the last 8 years. So they're unable to sustain the training that they were giving Ukraine for the last 8 years under relatively ideal conditions. Now in the middle of this conflict, it is less than ideal conditions. There's no way they can sustain that army, the size and the fighting effectiveness of that army in the middle of this conflict. It is impossible. But even if they could, this army that the US and NATO created for Ukraine ahead of this conflict, which began in February, late February, they lost Kherson. They lost Kherson and everything from Kherson, which is just north of Crimea, all the way to the Donbas region and the border with the Russian Federation, a land bridge. They failed to hold Mariupol. They have lost Mariupol. That is a city that Russia now controls. And they failed to stop Russia from shaping the battlefield in the Donbas region, beginning the process of encircling and destroying all of those thousands and thousands of forces, the best forces Ukraine has, essentially. They cannot stop that. So that army built up over the last 8 years, that is how they performed. They failed. And now you're in the middle of an intense conflict. You're not going to be able to even maintain those levels, let alone surpass them, which is what Ukraine would need to do if they were going to win this, which they have absolutely no way of doing. Sustained warfare requires sustained logistics. And by that I mean you have a defense industry, you have factories that are producing equipment, weapons, munitions. They send it to a warehouse or to stockpiles. They are brought to distribution centers and they work their way to the front line. Russia has that. They have the capacity to make 1 billion or more small arms rounds every year. They have tank factories, they have armored vehicle factories, they have everything that they need. It is producing all of this equipment, all of these munitions, and it is being brought to the front line. They're able to do that. They were able to do it in Syria from 2015 onward, and that is quite a ways away from Russian territory. Ukraine is directly on Russia's border. So it is actually a much easier logistical problem to solve for Russia. And as Russia is doing that, they are also targeting whatever is left of Ukrainian logistics, even what they're using to get equipment, even equipment that they can't even really use effectively from the West. They are targeting that as it works its way toward the front lines. Ukrainian presidential advisor Alexei Orestovich, this is from Reuters. Russia has destroyed most of Ukraine's defense industry, presidential advisor. The article says Russia has destroyed almost all of Ukraine's defense industry, Ukrainian presidential advisor Alexei Orestovich said on Thursday in a video address where he welcomed the terms of a proposed peace deal as a win for Ukraine. They have practically destroyed our defense industry. And since then, Russia has specifically targeted and destroyed other facilities that Ukraine was using to manufacture weapons. So it's not looking good for Ukraine. This is a pattern developing that is very familiar to people who followed the conflict in Syria from the beginning up to today. Check out this New York Times article from 2013. Arms airlift to Syria rebels expands with aid from CIA. With help from the CIA, Arab governments and Turkey have sharply increased their military aid to Syria's opposition fighters in recent months, expanding a secret airlift of arms and equipment for the uprising against President Bashar al-Assad. According to air traffic data, interviews with officials in several countries, and the accounts of rebel commanders. The New York Times also says, from offices at secret locations, American intelligence officers have helped the Arab governments shop for weapons, just like the UK is doing right now, including a large procurement from Croatia, and have vetted rebel commanders and groups to determine who should receive the weapons as they arrive. Yeah, right. Well, we know how that turned out. That didn't work. Before Russia's intervention in 2015, flooding the country with weapons and militants who are fighting against the Syrian Arab army, who had a dwindling amount of air power and really did not have significant advantages on the battlefield. That was one thing. But as soon as Russia intervened in 2015 and onward, one of the first things they did was strike at the supply lines coming out of Turkey, reducing it to a trickle. They also helped reorganize the Syrian Arab army. Iran, Hezbollah from Lebanon, they sent additional fighters, manpower on the ground. Russia, through its logistics and other specialized forces, they helped turn the tide on the ground. Now you had these militants coming in with a hodgepodge of weapons, no real efficient logistical chain, because it was not a functioning, organized military. Syria didn't just stop, put in check the US proxy war against them. They rolled it up. They ran them out of city after city after city. And the only reason why peace and stability hasn't been fully returned to Syria is because the US and its allies intervened directly. The US put troops on the ground in eastern Syria, east of the Euphrates River, and NATO member Turkey took sections of northern Syria. And in these regions, Turkey and the US, they are harboring what's left, the remnants of this proxy war. And that is where it stands today. It is a standoff, if you will. The same process is unfolding in Ukraine. This is why when you hear people talking about a Western intervention in Ukraine, it most likely will manifest itself as a Western incursion into Western Ukraine to create a buffer zone, and to create a buffer zone in such a way that it avoids any sort of direct conflict, combat with Russian forces. They might even try to grab Odessa to ensure that whatever is left of Ukraine at the end of this conflict has some sort of access to the sea. We watched them do that in Syria. We are watching that more or less take shape in Ukraine. There is no way for the West to supply and to sustain the Ukrainian military during this conflict. It is impossible. It cannot happen. It's just a matter of reality, how warfare operates, how logistics operate, and the fact that Ukraine does not have sustained logistical support, therefore they cannot sustain combat operations, significant combat operations. If you look at everything that has happened from the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 up to today, one thing that you'll notice is that as military technology advances and as it proliferates, this technological disparity between US forces and the countries they attack, that has narrowed, that has diminished. And the ability for the US to just go into a country and roll it up, that is not something they can do anymore. And because of Russia's habit of getting directly involved, and because of the capabilities of their weapons, especially their anti-access area denial, like its air defense system, which the US admits is the best in the world. Because of that, they are being checked. The US is being checked everywhere. And they have to settle for less optimal choices than they would prefer. They would have preferred to have overthrown the government of Syria. They failed that. The only thing that they could get out of that is spoiling absolute victory by maintaining that occupation in the east and Turkey's occupation in the north, and this kind of standoff. But what's left of Syria, which is, by the way, most of the most significant population centers, that is there to stay. There's really no way the West is going to wrest that back because of everything that unfolded. And now, because of that, other nations are aware of what they need to do to protect themselves. And so what it does is it puts the US in a weaker position than before all of this started. And in terms of Ukraine, that really looks like what is going to end up happening there as well. And then when you translate all of this to the US confrontation with China, essentially the same process is going to play out. This is the United States refusing to pick the one option that actually makes sense, which is coexistence with Russia, China, and the rest of the world. The abandoning of the notion of achieving primacy over the globe, which now can never happen for the United States. It will never happen. If they could admit that, be resigned to that, and play a part in a new multipolar world, all of their problems would actually be solved. But because they won't, because they, for whatever reason, cannot, this is what is going to end up happening around the globe. So people need to be prepared for that, and they need to understand how this is playing out. We saw it play out in Syria. We were watching it play out in Ukraine. We need to be aware of how it will play out on the next battlefield the US chooses to light on fire. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do, and it helps the channel grow. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below for other places you can find my work, like on Odyssey, on Rumble, and also on Telegram, just in case YouTube decides to delete me off their platform. Also in the video description below are all of the links that I just referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also through PayPal. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's month to month, through one-time donations, or even if you're just helping share my work with others, or sending kind words and news tips, I appreciate all of that help. That all makes a difference. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.